Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff Mom Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. And welcome to another edition of a book club. Content warning before we get into this one, we are going to be talking about intergenerational racial trauma, slavery, death, sexual assaults. They're all like heavy topics. So it's not that we're going to get into them too much, but they're like still really heavy topics.
Right.
So take care of yourself. Do what you need to do. Today, we are discussing the beautifully illustrated and written graphic novel and memoir, Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts, written by Dr. Rebecca Hall and illustrated by Hugo Martinez. And it depicts the difficult journey Dr. Hall, a former attorney and part-time teacher and historian, embarked upon to dig up the lost and erased histories of slave revolts in the U.S. led by Black enslaved women. It primarily focuses on revolts near New York, although there's a bunch of other things going on as well. And New York is Dr. Hall's hometown, so she was curious about it. Or also slave revolts on ships. And it is interwoven with how systemic racism that this country was built upon obstructed her research all along the way, and how it impacts her daily life, personally and professionally, especially given that her paternal grandparents were both born enslaved, and just how she interacts with the lives of people she's teaching or has taught. She delves into court documents, the logs of ships carrying enslaved people, old letters, forensic evidence from bones, and so many other things to track down these erased stories. And it's a really, really great depiction of the struggles of a researcher and a historian to find these stories. Dr. Hall is an activist, educator, and scholar. She has a history serving as an attorney, yes, for low-income tenants and those without homes. She is a writer and a publisher, especially on topics of race and gender. And the tagline is, "The past is gone, but we still live in its wake." And the title actually works on a bunch of different levels, which is cool. The art is very, very striking. It's beautifully done in shades of black. It's kind of hard to describe, but just very, very good, very beautiful, and just draws you in.
Right. If you actually go and follow Dr. Rebecca Hall's Twitter, you can see examples from Hugo Martinez's drawing, and you'll see what it could be like. I think she does have some excerpts in her Twitter, because whole other thing, Twitter tried to suppress her book as well, and it did the opposite, which is amazing, and I'm glad for it, because that's how we found it. But yeah, if you wanted to see an example without buying the book, you should buy the book. But it is an amazing depiction, and he does an amazing job in really showing the depth and the strength within these horrific conversations and tales. And he does it in a way that's not sadistic, I guess is the best word, which can happen pretty quickly in a story like this, which is honest and true. He really makes sure to exemplify the strengths of the enslaved people rather than showing like the disgusting disasters and all of the horrifying acts or horrifying things that was happening against them, the abuse and the assault and murder that is talked about rather than anything else. But yeah, it's a really great illustration, and I think he does a great job in making sure that what her words, her profound words, and her words of a lot of depth and feeling, that it's translated on these pages.
Yeah. And it was interesting. I read a bunch of like interviews and articles about it, and about how this was a difficult project for a lot of reasons. But one of them is, how do you capture kind of the pain of like being this researcher and going through this? And it's not like a typical, quote, like graphic novel type thing. Like it's, you go to a library and you're doing this research and things like that. So it was very, very interesting. But yeah, okay, very basically, the plot follows Dr. Hall's decision to dig into justice and the history of Black women and deciding to pursue all the stories she could find about Black women-led slave revolts. And it begins with her working as an attorney, questioning what justice means in systems that are inherently racist and sexist, kind of seeing it play out over and over again. So she decides to work on a dissertation of women-led slave revolts, particularly in nearby New York. But in search of documentation and evidence, she keeps running into scraps and dead ends. And she is determined to tell these hidden stories and is relentless But this is all happening while she is dealing with the fallout of slavery and racism in doing this research, whether it's officials barring her from accessing records for BS reasons or confronting the legacy of enslavement and racism in terms of her students and her child, her own family, all of those things. So definitely check it out. It's not a long read. I won't say it's like an easy read because obviously it's very painful material, but it's like so powerful and you should read it.
Right.
You should read it.
So we can say it's a short read, but it doesn't have to be if you're really focusing on the art and the graphics that bring out the story. As a plus, I did listen to the audio version, mistakenly thinking that was the actual book, but it's a fantastic add-on. I believe they describe it. The extended story is the story of the story, essentially, about how it came out. And it's a full cast, and it has a lot of, it's a full live cast reading, as if you're there and it's a play. You know, we've done this often with fiction type of audio. Anney does it with her fiction of the month. But this is not exactly fiction. It is her adventure in getting these. So we don't see the results necessarily of what we see here, some of the things that she was able to find finally, but what we do is hear her struggle and her journey into getting to this point and releasing and writing this novel. So it's a fantastic hearing. If you get a chance to listen to it, you really, 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 really should, because it's a whole different experience for the same theme and wonderful take that she has placed on it. And great acting, because apparently they won, they're nominated for I'm going to call it Audie Awards, AUDIES. Well, they're a finalist for the Audie's 2023 award. So very cool. It's definitely well worth the listen. If nothing else, to hear what she went through is amazing.
And it's kind of, I gave the plot rundown. It's kind of hard to describe though, but essentially you're getting her version of her researching these stories, and then we get snippets of those stories. So it's sort of juxtaposed against each other. So some themes, I would say at the beginning, you see her working as an attorney and having this question of what is justice in this white supremacist, sexist, racist society, when she's seeing these outcomes over and over again. And as I said, she was a attorney for low-income tenants. And so she's just kind of seeing this over and over, kind of hearing this really racist, advice of well, you have to kind of behave in this certain way so they don't think you're the angry Black woman in court and all of those things. And having a lot of questions well, what does this mean?
Right. I think it's very interesting. And I know there was something that I really touched in on with her. She was talking about the fact that, yes, immediately they didn't assume that she was a lawyer, that she was one of the plaintiffs or the defendants, and having to be I'm the representative here, please let me by. Having to prove herself as the educated person who, with the law degree, unlike many of the clerks or any of them in there, or the deputies. But then also having to give advice and seeing the bias within courts. And I've talked about this many a times on mic about my own experiences being in the courtroom and talking to children and talking about who they were and how things will play out. And she talks to one Black woman who is one of her clients, but she also has a white woman that lived in the same building and had the same lawsuit. The white woman got all this money, and the Black plaintiff in the audio, so I'm going to say this, in the audio, the Black woman was I feel like this is good for me, this is amazing, they've already set a precedent. She's well, if you want to get what she got, you're going to have to do exactly what she did, which is the white woman tears, pronouncing everything unusually, being very quiet and polite and all these things. Well, she probably would have been already, but making it be white though. And when the woman came to in front of it, she got half the amount that the white woman did. And that's how it goes. And then having the regret of telling this woman, her client, be white, be more white, be this, because this is how the justice system works. And I've had these moments where I've told young Black kids, hey, I hate to tell you this, and this is going to be the God's honest truth, and I don't look at this, but because this system is already set up to have you fail. They have already had bias against you. It doesn't matter. Before you walked in, whether it's for whatever, whatnot, this specific group of people, and there were specific people that I would have to look out for certain types of lawyers, certain types of judges, and who was going to do what, and who had the racial bias, and trying to teach the kid to play the game instead of trying to change the system. And I know that's kind of the beginning of why she starts really going into teaching and then really going into research. And I hate that too, I hate that I was a part of that. And as a non-Black person, it's even worse coming from me. And I hate that I was a part of that system, but doing what I could do at that moment. And she talks about that, having that guilt and playing into the system and then coming out of it and trying to break that system. And then, of course, this is a whole different conversation, but it hit me real hard when she was talking about this and knowing exactly what she meant. And of course, I feel like my guilt is definitely different and my resolve was different. And that seeing this and how ugly and gross it really is.
Yeah. Yeah. And we do see Dr. Hall kind of grappling with that throughout it, even in her teaching and her research, all of that stuff. And so she's seeing this as an attorney, decides to get her dissertation, decides to focus on slave revolts led by Black women. And there's a quote in there about kind of being haunted by the legacy of slavery. Quote, "Sometimes when you think you're hunting down the past is hunting you. I was born to tell the stories." So she does describe that. She does describe this feeling of like, I need to find these stories that have been erased and I need to tell them. And they are a part of my life and my history and the history that's shaping all of this. And it, like I said, it is a really, really excellent depiction of what it's like doing historical research. This is like, we've researched for this show, but nowhere near this level.
Right.
So this is from articles I've read from historians about it,
right.
saying that this is a very excellent depiction of what it's like to do historical research. And that did set it apart from most graphic novels. Like I said, it was kind of a new take on this idea. And that's one of the reasons she talks about, which she also at the back of at least the copy I had, there was a Q&A with her, and she was describing why she decided to do a graphic novel. And that was one of the reasons, was like, this will be a new way to really showcase, illustrate what it's like to be a historian doing this stuff.
Right. Especially when it comes to the limited amount, and we're going to talk more about this, especially when it comes to the limited amount of information, the amount of information that is erased and the amount of information people want to hide. Like the odds are stacked against her for so many reasons. And her traveling all over the world, she really does, trying to get this and hunt down this information. Sounds exhausting, but inspiring. It's real exhausting.
Yes. Honestly, I was like, this feels like, I do love those scenes in movies where they're doing the montage and they're like, I gotta go here, I gotta go here, I gotta go here. It was like that. Like, I feel like they should make a show about how she did this.
Yeah.
Honestly.
I mean, she's done the audio and the book. It's time for a show now.
I agree. But yeah, it showcases like the traveling of information, because she's looking at, before the internet, obviously, but so like on boats, or like, where did this information end up after it was on this boat? The thought process of like, well, this piece of information is missing, where could it be? Like all of those things. And then, this real pain and frustration of the research of finding something like a total dead end or something's completely erased, and like you'll never know what happened. So it excellently depicted that. And then there was also just obviously like the history of slavery and seeing the aftermath of slavery everywhere. And that goes back to, this pain of the loss of history, of erasure, of the question of what gets recorded. And so, for instance, like one of the first things she does is she finds like these names, and she finds very brief snippets about them and is trying to piece together their story. And then in the end, it's just erased and she can't find it. And here's a quote, "I can't find her. I'll never know what happened to Sarah or Abigail."
Right. And this was specifically to a revolt that happened on the state grounds, because we do talk a lot more about ships and the travel when they're at sea, but in the transatlantic slave trade. But where they were talking specifically about a couple of revolts that have happened where they did sentence people to death, enslaved peoples to death and or jailed. And this conversation about how it got lost. And she was trying to find out what happened to these women, who were the ones, because they just became numbers, essentially. And the pain of them just being numbered and being property in itself is horrendous. And also knowing, and we're going to talk about this, is like her family, immediate family members, essentially had experienced something to this, and that was not too far from her generationally. But like in the conversation that she was trying to discover who did this, who was this, who did this, and having a few names to the many that died, and then not even having the correct names, and not even being able to, like, finding some information just enough that you know partially what happened, but not the ending. And the trauma of not being able to have a resolve in something that heartbreaking and something that is so triggering in itself, that she had to go on this journey without any resolution.
Right. And that's another thing that I thought this book did an excellent job at, is really showing the physical impact of researching something so horrendous, of researching something that directly impacts you, that is in your family, of like, she experiences nausea. She just talks about like pain in her body and being so exhausted, and in mental health, and having these questions and like these physical things that are happening to her because of this research she is doing, which I think is really important to recognize. And then there's also several instances of her trying to do this research, very like legitimately doing nothing wrong, but these white officials blocking access to documents. So we see it in the United States when I believe it's like an archive she's trying to go to. And they're like, no, you didn't go through the right procedures. We can't let you in. And she's like, but I kind of did. And also I have a flight. And they're like, no way. And then she does travel to the United Kingdom and is like, trying to get some documents from a museum. And the officials, the white officials there are very like, oh, no, we don't have any. We were good in abolition. Don't you remember? Very, very defensive. And then she goes to visit Lloyd's of London and try to get their archives. And Lloyd's of London got started insuring slave ships and still around.
Right.
And, they just flat out refused. And she told them what she was doing, and here's why. And all this, like, is totally legitimate. Like, they had no reason not to let her get that information, but they absolutely refuse. So this is another thing she's constantly fighting with to get to these stories, of which many of them she might finally get that information, and it's just not there.
Right. And I think that's part of the reason, and I know she talks about this, is that the focus is partially on her trying to get this research, is because of the way she was railroaded essentially by white people who may even claim to be allies. Like, she talks about how, again, she comes to the UK and she's like, everybody's so nice in comparison to what happened in the US, but the Black community in the UK were like, they're just being nice to you because, they're trying to play nice while you're here because you're a visitor, essentially. And that it is not that wonderful as they would want it to be and make it seem. And we've talked about that, the different biases that happen in different areas and regions. And just because it seems nice doesn't mean that's the truth of it all. Just because there may not be a focus on some of the things that happen in other places doesn't mean that discrimination and racism isn't there. But I really do think it's interesting that we talk about people who make money, with which insurance companies have definitely been reamed over the coals, as they should be continuously, because it is an ugly, ugly trade and business, and it's fairly racist and discriminatory today. So knowing that they're trying to hide some of that history that absolutely was making money off of the backs of enslaved people and their deaths, and their demise and their murder, all of that, and their profiting, and the white people who profited off of that. It's a horrendous and ugly business, which to a certain degree, they still do that today. That's a whole different conversation. Don't get me started, because I will. But what we see in her conversation is that it's so hard to even get past those blocks that had already been set up by white supremacy from way back when, from the beginning, essentially. For her to find information, there hasn't been much progress in breaking down the white supremacy to tell the truth about the enslaved people and the revolts that happened.
Right. And on top of that, another thing that she touches on is these myths around, like, enslaved people didn't resist, or other stories that are basically just deflecting the blame from anywhere where it should be, which was the white slavers and people propping it up. But that being so important, it's like this clarity when telling the story of enslavement, and why it was one of the reasons why she wanted to do it, even though it was so painful when it was so difficult, and there are all these things in her way. And she did find some facts that sort of were telling her, like, oh yes, I knew I was onto something. One of them is 1 in 10 ships of enslaved people experienced a revolt. And here's a quote: "The more women on board a slave ship, the more likely a revolt." So again, where is that history? She's like found this, but the stories aren't there. And one of the reasons that she and others think that this is in part because of gendered stereotypes that women aren't a threat. So they were forced to stay on deck near weapons and also where they could be sexually abused. But this was a way that they could lead these revolts.
Right. And she talks about the fact that many a times that the white slavers and those on the board on ships really were naive, thinking that women wouldn't do anything. And so therefore they just really let them be. Of course, they talk about the horrendousness of the activities that happened on board when they were released and why it was so horrific. And of course, that to me is like that. Yeah, a lot of the conversation that she has in the books is that many of the enslaved at that time would rather die than go into this horrific situation that they know is even more awful than could be told, and that there was no other options, knowing that in the sea they would die, but that would be much better than what they would have to suffer in the mainland and then in the colonies at that time. And we saw that during the revolts in many of things. They talk about Indian Sam and the unknown woman in the beginning of the book, which is one of the big revolts. And they talk about how she could not find this woman and who she was and where she came from, but both were prosecuted because she had gone, and her and Sam, who I believe was a native person who was enslaved as well, that they would rather die than continue the way they had. And they took out the entire family because they knew if one was alive, that they would still be under ownership and would still be horrifically abused and enslaved. So all had to go. And it was an interesting, in my audio version, they do have it enacted. They enact the whole story. And it's interesting how they hear it, they even bring the children of the white plantation owners. They have that as a part of the conversation, and then have the conversation between them about why this is so important. We also find the gendered prosecution. Essentially, the woman is burned at the stake while the man was hung, and it was during that time that this had been where the women were under property, whether they are white or of a different race. They were under the property of their husband as well. So therefore, as property, this was treason to go at. Instead of just murder, it was treason. So they had a different type of punishment, which I found interesting as well. And apparently this was the revolt, according to Dr. Hall's research and the book, that became a whole decree about how to keep revolting enslaved people in line, quote unquote, and had a specific punishment for them. And that was the beginning of prosecuting insurrectionists, as they called them.
Yeah. And then to go back to your point, there is a pretty upsetting and moving scene where Dr. Hall is teaching, and she's recommending Beloved, Toni Morrison's Beloved. And one of the students comes up to her afterwards and it's like, I already read it. Can I please not read it again? Like, it was great. I'm glad I read it, but it's a very difficult read. And later, Dr. Hall is at her home and kind of looking at her young son and thinking, like, having this really emotional moment of, she's struggling to come to terms with wanting a child, thinking it would be better for a child to be dead rather than live enslaved.
Right.
Because of the book. And that's just another example of that trauma, that racial trauma, intergenerational trauma, and the things that she, in her own professional and personal life, has to deal with.
Right. Yeah. And along with that, they do talk about those who are raped by the plantation owners and the colonizers. I'm going to call them colonizers because I don't want to call them anything else. At that point in time, and how they did not want to bring that to life, essentially, which was done out of hate and anger and like abuse and ownership and all of these things as a way of power, to control power over women. They even talked about a specific woman who was a leader of the area and how they sent homage to her and revolted in her name because what they did to her, they pretty much worked her to death, is the phrase, which is seen often in that conversation, and how she had been someone that had saved so many of the enslaved people at that point in time, and how they all did it in her name. And then one of the things that she helped with was trying to get rid of unwanted pregnancies by rape and sexual assault, which was all too common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is something that was present in a lot of in this book, was Black women honoring and supporting other Black women coming together for these revolts or coming together for something like that. And then you get to see it on a really personal level when there's almost this like memory of Dr. Hall reaching out to the memory of her grandmother about surviving enslavement. And it's a really beautiful like back and forth that they have where Dr. Hall is just trying to understand her grandmother and what happened to her and her life and make it relate to what she's going through and what she's trying to do in these stories she's trying to tell. It's a very, very moving scene.
Right. She uses her as a guidance. And I loved every bit of that, like praying for her grandmother's spirit to guide her to these truths, because she was having so many roadblocks, but knowing that this is something that she was supposed to do, that this is something that's been calling to her, that all the rejection and that all the racism that she has dealt with in her path while it came to teaching and all the pushbacks while she was researching, that it was for a purpose, and that her grandmother, who was finally freed through all that enslavement and was the major patriarch and push for not for only for the family, but her father specifically. And there's a beautiful exchange where we see a flashback between her father and his mother and his father and how they really grew. And I think they were part of the big Great Migration because they had been threatened bodily harm and then constantly taken after. They were talking about having to deal with the Ku Klux Klan by one of the great-grandfathers and how he dealt with it and what that looked like, and really trying to start over and unfortunately doing what they had to do in order to survive, but still having the spirit of the grandmother who really kept that family alive with her hope and her, obviously, power and constant work to provide for her family. But it was a beautiful exchange and in this conversation of all the darkness of light growing out of that darkness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really was. And then the book does a really excellent job of just pointing out all of these things and how they are still present in our society today. So it ties it together with current police violence against the Black population, just like all these current issues that are that we can't like erase as much as people try to. Right. The history of that, like it's still here. We're still feeling all of these impacts, and Black people especially are still feeling all of these impacts. So it's a really good like tying together of why it matters that she wrote this, that she did this research on all of that, and that we all know it. and how it is still here. It hasn't gone away.
Yeah. And obviously with things like her book that, again, kept getting suppressed on social media, as today we've talked about the conservative pushback to learn these truths because people are afraid of what they will look like, and which is exactly what we talk about, why people are blocking archival things because they don't want to be held responsible, or they don't even want to be shown to be even associated with that light, which I found it interesting because I had a moment of thinking about what happened with the Nazis and the Holocaust and how Germany's response, and we've talked about this before, was completely different. Of course, there's still people who want to try to deny it and hide things, but the information is a little more seen. And that's an interesting look at what has happened when things can actually be learned. Well, hopefully people don't make the same mistakes again or watch out for warning signs and what happens when we try to ignore history. And I find that interesting that we know so much less of something that was so prevalent, not even that long ago, that happened to so many groups of people across the world. And this is unfortunate that she had so many roadblocks that she can't even give the proper credit and names, but has to fill in the stories with some of the facts that she got, which are amazing. And the art is amazing. It really just brings it to life in a way, in a different perspective. But again, that the fact that we have to struggle to get to these points. And we've talked about it before, how little history that we know of those marginalized communities and how often they do try to hide it. And hopefully we will get more and more people who do the hard work like this. And we are so grateful for that. We would continue to make sure it is being spread. That so it won't die out.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't recommend it enough. Obviously, like the questions in the back are really great too. Her answers to the questions in the back, really good. The audio that Samantha was mentioning. So there's a lot of stuff here to like really paint a full picture of what all of the difficulties of this getting made. But it's so important and it's so well done. So can't recommend enough. Go check it out.
Go buy copies. Do it now.
Yes. In the meantime, if you have any suggestions for what our next book club pick should be, you can email us at stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff I've Never Told You. We're also on YouTube now if you want to check it out that way. Thanks as always to our super producer, Christina.
Thank you, Christina.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.